Modern society is currently facing a wide range of serious problems that are, to me, quite evident. These include economic, political, environmental, and many other challenges. They involve issues such as rising competition with China, extreme inequality, ongoing supply chain disruptions, global warming, and countless other concerns that could easily be listed. Today's younger generations are growing up under difficult circumstances. These problems are highly complex, with many interconnected causes and contributing factors. However, there is one major driving force that I believe deserves significant attention, one powerful enough to justify an entire video on its own. A substantial portion of today's problems can be linked to poor decisions made by a single generation, the baby boomers. In many respects, the impact of the boomer generation is unmatched in history due to the sheer level of social and systemic damage created during their decades of dominance. This may sound exaggerated or overly critical, but throughout this video, I will argue that the baby boomers have left behind a chaotic and deeply flawed system for later generations to deal with, one that is incredibly difficult to repair. In this video, I'll examine the main areas through which the baby boomer generation has negatively affected society. So let's begin. A large part of how boomers view the world is shaped by their perception of World War II, which played an important role in shaping their early lives and cultural outlook. Even today, World War II continues to captivate people as the event that launched the modern historical era we are now living in. With its many well-known figures and defining moments, it remains one of the most studied periods in history. There is no better place to explore this topic than Magellan TV. I recently watched a series there called The Day When, which focuses on the critical decisions made by some of the most influential leaders during World War II. The series offers deep insight into the enormous pressures and difficult choices they faced during that time. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming service created by filmmakers, offering one of the strongest selections of historical and educational content available. They cover a wide range of topics, including geology, astronomy, true crime, ancient civilizations, science, and religion. Whether you are interested in World War II, the Roman Empire, or any other historical or scientific subject, Magellan TV has something for you. The platform is compatible with nearly all devices and streams in 4K HD at no extra cost. It's an excellent learning resource at an affordable price. In addition to this, Waterfalthist viewers can receive a 1-month free trial by using the link in the video description. Magellan TV is designed for individuals who enjoy learning, so check it out today and start exploring the topics that interest you most. For those unfamiliar with this, and acknowledging that generational definitions can vary from country to country, the baby boomer generation is generally defined as individuals born between the end of World War II and 1964. This group was extraordinarily large, the biggest generation in history at the time. For the purpose of this analysis, the focus will primarily be on the Western world, particularly the United States. While my primary focus will be on the United States, I will occasionally shift my attention to other regions, since many of the developments seen in America also apply to other parts of the world. Before going further, I want to make something clear. I am not criticizing baby boomers as individuals. Most groups of people, including this one, consist largely of good and honorable individuals. If that were not the case, society itself could not function. There are countless baby boomers who are exceptional people, both in terms of their character and their impressive accomplishments. If you are a baby boomer watching this video, I want to emphasize that I am not attacking you on a personal level. I do not know your life story or your experiences. My argument, instead, is that the baby boomer generation as a collective group caused widespread harm to society through the decisions made during its period of dominance. This impact is too significant to ignore or minimize. In other words, your parents or relatives may be among the most wonderful individuals imaginable. I am not criticizing them. I am examining the broader demographic patterns and their historical effects. In this video, I will trace how the baby boomer generation influenced the world throughout the course of their lives, examining their impact on nearly every major part of society. In many ways, this is a historical analysis of the baby boomers. As with anything complex, their influence includes both negative and positive outcomes, and I will also acknowledge the good they contributed to the world. It is difficult to fully comprehend just how large the boomer generation was. By 1961, Roughly half of the American population was under the age of 25. Before World War II, most Western countries experienced low and unsustainable birth rates for many years, largely due to the impact of the Great Depression and the war itself. For many regions, especially in Europe, even the 1920s were far from ideal. However, when World War II ended and a period of prosperity followed, birth rates surged dramatically, with families having children at unprecedented levels. This enormous population growth meant that, from the post-war era onward, baby boomers became the dominant demographic group. This influence appeared very early on, as businesses shifted their focus toward the growing youth population. Television programs, toys, and other products were heavily targeted toward young boomers, shaping the culture of the time. Excluding the most extreme historical atrocities associated with figures such as Hitler and Stalin, the world the boomers grew up in can reasonably be seen as one of the most favorable periods in human history. Many things had gone right. The Industrial Revolution had introduced major advances in productivity and technology. Before World War II, wages had been held back for complex economic and political reasons, but after the war, standards of living rose at the fastest rate ever recorded. Virtually every major quality of life measure, including diet, physical health, community strength, social networks, and low levels of political tension, reached historic highs. It was truly a golden age for the average individual. On top of that, the world was experiencing massive technological advancement was rapidly transforming everyday life, affecting ordinary people in deeply practical ways. The spread of automobiles, telephones, televisions, washing machines, birth control, and similar innovations made daily living significantly easier than ever before. This period was also characterized by unusually low crime rates and unprecedented levels of safety when compared to any previous era. Large-scale pandemics and widespread diseases were not a major reality for most people at that time. Meanwhile, enormous national projects were underway, such as the Marshall Plan, the mission to land a man on the moon, and the construction of the federal highway system. While the population was growing quickly, food production and other essential resources were increasing at an even faster pace. Most American baby boomers, and likely those in parts of Europe as well, grew up in societies that were extraordinarily safe and prosperous by historical standards. Only by understanding these conditions can we truly make sense of the cultural shifts that accompanied the baby boomer generation. From this setting, a dominant boomer mindset can be identified, one that largely transcends political or religious beliefs. At its core is the idea, I want everything now, with no intention of preserving anything for the future, while at the same time viewing judgment or assumptions about others as morally unacceptable. Perhaps this phrasing is somewhat harsh, and I may be speaking too bluntly, but throughout this video I will attempt to demonstrate how this worldview has appeared repeatedly throughout history in real and measurable ways. To some degree, this mindset is understandable given the historical situation boomers experienced. They lived through the most rapid rise in living standards in recorded history. Many of them enjoyed comfortable and stable lives, even though their parents had often worked extremely hard in dangerous or difficult conditions, such as coal mining, westward expansion, or other forms of harsh labor. Because of this contrast, the belief that life would continue to improve seemed deeply rooted in their expectations. In addition to this, the boomer generation was the first to live fully under the shadow of nuclear weapons. As a result, many people reasoned that there might be no future to save for at all. If nuclear destruction could happen tomorrow, why not enjoy life to the fullest today? Another critical factor that shaped the baby boomers was that they were the first generation to grow up with television as a normal and constant presence. This development likely had profound and lasting cultural effects that we may not fully understand for many years, since the technology is still relatively recent in historical terms. Some studies suggest that populations raised with widespread access to television tend to have less nuanced views of the world, weaker emotional regulation, and lower levels of cognitive engagement. Several fascinating research findings explore this topic in detail. For the baby boomers, television represented a massive social experiment. It introduced a powerful form of mass media into everyday life, fundamentally shaping the way information was shared, interpreted, and understood on a global scale. In earlier generations, entertainment largely centered on reading, and there is a significant difference between reading and watching television. Reading is naturally introspective. It is an individual activity that requires reflection on the events unfolding in the story. Books also provide direct access to a character's inner thoughts and personal perspective. Television, on the other hand, presents images and adds background music that influences how viewers are meant to feel. The viewer cannot directly access a character's internal monologue, and as a result, the experience demands less interpretation and critical thinking than reading does. At the same time, there was a rapid change in parenting approaches during the baby boomer era. In previous generations, parenting focused on guiding children toward adulthood by assigning responsibility and encouraging them to adapt to the adult world. The goal was to prepare children to function effectively as independent adults. However, with the baby boomers, new parenting theories gained popularity. These ideas emphasized appealing to children's feelings, cooperating with them more, showing greater generosity, and reducing strict control, largely out of concern that discipline could lead to psychological issues, as discussed by thinkers like Freud. This led to a much more permissive style of parenting than had been seen historically. When the baby boomer generation began to assert itself in society, the impact was highly visible. Because of their enormous population size, the 1960s, when the oldest boomers were entering adolescence, took on the intensity of a national internal conflict in the United States. The 1960s marked one of the most dramatic cultural transformations in world history, influencing nearly every aspect of society. As teenagers and young adults, baby boomers stepped onto the global stage through their strong connection to rock and roll music. Rock music represented almost everything that traditional society had previously opposed, challenging long-standing social, religious, and moral standards. Many of the stars associated with this movement appeared hypersexual, self-centered, and often struggled with substance abuse. The phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll emerged for a reason. Despite this, the musical innovation of that era was undeniable. Rock music may represent the most significant revolution in the history of popular music. Bands such as the Beatles became almost godlike figures to their fans. When John Lennon stated that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, it was not especially controversial in Britain at the time. However, for the parents of the baby boomers, their children's open embrace of sexually expressive music and rebellious behavior was shocking, especially within the context of Western society's long tradition of religious modesty. For the baby boomers, this cultural shift represented, to the baby boomers, their parents often seemed outdated and disconnected from the modern world. One of the most important characteristics of the boomer mindset is the belief that history, in a sense, began with them. In their eyes, the old world effectively ended with World War II, and they represented a new generation meant to teach the world a better way forward. This attitude was especially visible during the 1960s, when many believed that peace, love, freedom, and self-expression were all that truly mattered, and that older generations were rigid, close-minded, and stuck in the past. On some level, this perspective is understandable. The world wars were such massive, world-shaking events that they can feel like a dividing line in history. However, one of the most significant flaws of the boomer generation is what could be seen as an unwillingness to fully consider the lessons of earlier eras. Because they viewed themselves as unique and transformative, they often saw past experiences as irrelevant or outdated. This outlook is also reflected in the strong emphasis baby boomers placed on the major events of their youth. For them, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the Vietnam War, and the Watergate scandal represented some of the most important moments in American history. While these were undeniably significant events, they were not unprecedented. The United States had experienced wars, political corruption, and the deaths of national leaders before. However, because these events occurred during the boomers' formative years, they took on an almost unmatched historical importance in their minds. From my own experience in school, roughly between the ages of 12 and 18, I noticed this influence clearly. I ended up reading multiple books focused on the Vietnam War, largely because the educational system around me had been shaped by the baby boomer generation. I often questioned why so much attention was placed on Vietnam rather than on events such as World War II, the Crusades, or the Roman Empire, periods that could arguably be considered more historically significant. The answer, I believe, is that boomers viewed their own time as one of the most defining eras in history. By understanding this belief, that they represented a completely new chapter in human history, we can better grasp how and why such rapid cultural changes occurred under their influence. One of the most dramatic examples is the sexual revolution. In 1960, the expectation was that sleeping with someone carried the assumption of eventual marriage. By 1970, remaining a virgin after high school could be seen as unusual, and for many young men, social status was increasingly tied to the number of sexual partners they had. There is little historical evidence of a transformation this rapid and extreme in attitudes toward something as fundamental as sex. A crucial factor behind both the sexual revolution and the rise of rock and roll culture was the introduction of the birth control pill. For the first time in history, sex and pregnancy could be separated with a high degree of reliability. In practical terms, this meant that the traditional sexual rules upheld by earlier generations no longer seemed relevant to the world the baby boomers were growing up in. From their point of view, their elders' standards truly did appear outdated in the context of this new social reality. That generation experienced more casual sexual relationships than any group before them in recorded history. One of the most significant changes was a much greater tolerance toward many aspects of life, which became closely associated with the baby boomers. This shift was partly influenced by the increased wealth of society at the time, reducing the number of harsh, survival-based choices people once had to make, choices centered on whether one group or another would endure. In addition, some of the most disturbing practices that had existed in certain non-European societies, such as human sacrifice, slavery, and harems, had already been abolished over time through Western colonial influence. At the same time, the extreme violence of World War II and the openly horrific actions of the Nazi regime made racist ideology increasingly unacceptable. An essential point about the world the boomers were raised in is that the Second World War was still a very recent memory. They were raised by a generation that had directly experienced that conflict, in a traditionally Christian society that believed in the idea of good and evil but was becoming uncomfortable with judging individuals on moral grounds alone. In this context, the Nazis came to represent the ultimate symbol of evil. This belief system deeply shaped the path of modern society, which consistently attempted to become the complete opposite of Nazi ideology. As a result, society increasingly prioritized anti-racism, international cooperation, pacifism, non-judgment, and similar values. Much of modern political philosophy developed as a reaction against what the Nazis represented. This brings us to the wider cultural influence the boomers had during their many years of dominance. The boomer mindset is visible in the success of the Star Wars films. In that story, the world is split between clear forces of good and evil, with heroic underdogs opposing a powerful and oppressive empire and achieving clean, decisive victories. Star Wars essentially became a myth-based retelling of how many Americans wished World War II had unfolded. It is also not a coincidence that Star Wars was released just as baby boomers began taking control of Hollywood. Younger generations often mock boomers as being disconnected from reality and sometimes accuse them of racism. However, the difference in attitudes toward race between previous generations and the boomers is dramatic. In many ways, boomers became victims of their own success. Their strong push for social justice succeeded so deeply that later generations went even further in the same direction. When boomers were children, nearly one-third of the United States was legally segregated, with Black Americans excluded from many parts of society. By the time the boomers had gained significant power, returning to such systems seemed not only unthinkable but morally unacceptable. A clear example of this transformation can be seen in academia. As boomers became the dominant group in universities, the political balance among professors shifted dramatically, from roughly one conservative for every 2 left-leaning professors to about 1 conservative for every 19 left-leaning professors. Despite this, many people still claim that boomers are politically conservative. What are you referring to? In one sense, that claim holds some truth, as baby boomers in the United States have often leaned toward economic conservatism. However, describing them as socially conservative is, in many ways, almost ironic. In reality, boomers became so much more socially liberal than their parents that their own children now label them conservative, only because newer generations have moved even further to the left. As a result, boomers have effectively become the new moral middle ground. The historian Carol Quigley explained that Western civilization, since the Renaissance, has moved through a series of ideological phases, each lasting roughly 80 years. There is not enough time to explore his full theory here, but those interested are encouraged to read more about it independently. Writing in the early 1960s, Quigley suggested that the period following World War II could be defined as the era of social justice, with its primary goal being the support and advancement of oppressed groups. This prediction appeared to come true during the decades in which the baby boomer generation dominated American culture, particularly from the 1980s to the present. During this time, the greatest shifts toward the liberation of historically oppressed groups, including Black people, women, and members of the LGBTQ+ community, occurred on a scale unmatched by any previous period in history. This strong concern for the marginalized stands as one of the most positive characteristics of the boomer generation. However, this empathy for oppressed groups was closely tied to the boomer embrace of permissiveness, or a live and let live philosophy taken to its fullest extent. As a result, many baby boomers became extremely hesitant to pass moral judgment on any individual or group. While this led to greater acceptance and equality in some areas, it also resulted in a widespread discomfort with making ethical distinctions of any kind. In fact, expressing judgment came to be seen as outdated or socially unacceptable. This mindset explains how sweeping changes occurred so rapidly under boomer influence. Large-scale immigration, the significant entry of women into the workforce, broader acceptance of gay individuals, the rise of the transgender movement, increasing racial tolerance, rapid digitization, and widespread deindustrialization. Whether these developments are viewed as positive or negative, they unfolded at an unprecedented pace, and anyone who criticized them was often dismissed as being out of touch or unable to understand the modern world. For a generation that grew up in extraordinary comfort and relative political stability, the idea that changes in social behavior could threaten the survival of society seemed absurd. Nothing was considered less fashionable among boomers than criticizing others for being sexually permissive, using drugs, questioning parental authority, or rejecting traditional values that had once been considered essential for stability and unity. The harshest insult a boomer could receive was simply being called square. Ultimately, the baby boomer generation represented an overwhelming wave of cultural transformation that pushed society toward greater permissiveness, often without deeply questioning its long-term purpose or consequences. Although the early beginnings of these shifts existed long before the boomers, it was their influence that caused these trends to accelerate and fully dominate modern life. When examining society shaped by the baby boomer generation, one of the most insightful anthropology texts is The Lonely Crowd by David Reisman, published in 1949. The book explores the cultural shifts that occurred in the United States beginning in the 19th century. In essence, it explains that in strongly Christian 19th century America, the primary moral focus was on doing what was objectively right, even if it was unpopular, in order to honor God. By contrast, in the 20th century, the priority shifted toward social acceptance, popularity, and fitting in with one's community. A clear example of this can be found in high school culture, which a friend of mine, J.J. McCullough, examined in an excellent video. This type of youth culture truly emerged with the baby boomer generation. The main goals became being popular, having an attractive boyfriend or girlfriend, hosting parties, and drinking. In many teen films, these behaviors are presented as moral achievements in themselves. When compared to the 19th century, the difference is striking. In a much harsher world, adolescence was viewed almost as an early stage of adulthood, where young men were expected to aspire to become explorers, inventors, or powerful leaders. The popular youth literature of the Victorian era emphasized adventure, discovery, and ambition. This is not meant to suggest that having fun is wrong or that enjoyment should be rejected. It would be unreasonable to claim that people should never celebrate or enjoy themselves. However, in the boomer worldview, pleasure was often treated as the main purpose of existence. This belief is visible throughout society, in everything from 24-hour fast food chains to pop music dominated by repetitive rhythms and provocative imagery. Beneath it all is the unspoken assumption that life is about pleasure and quick bursts of satisfaction, which is simply not true. While parties and celebrations can be enjoyable and provide a temporary release, they do not, on their own, provide real meaning or lasting fulfillment. Pursuing pleasure alone tends to lose its appeal over time, and endless indulgence often leads to dissatisfaction rather than happiness. In contrast, the pursuit of excellence, moral goodness, and meaningful achievement strengthens character and offers deeper fulfillment. The person who stays in one place focused only on amusement gains no recognition or legacy, whereas those who explore, challenge the unknown, and take risks are the ones who shape history and influence the world. Because of the relative ease and comfort in which many baby boomers were raised, they were often less intellectually and academically driven than earlier generations. It is surprisingly difficult to name a large number of influential boomer philosophers, thinkers, or great intellectual figures. In general, the baby boomer generation tended to view abstract thinking as impractical or unnecessary. This stands in clear contrast to the tremendous intellectual creativity that existed in the centuries preceding World War II, when deep philosophical thought and innovation played a central role in shaping civilization. You can observe a clear decline in the complexity of language used by presidential candidates over the course of the 20th century. This same trend is reflected in popular culture, including the types of films that gained popularity, which shifted from historical and culturally focused stories to ones centered on superheroes and fantasy. The baby boomer worldview largely dismissed abstract thinking and instead prioritized sensory stimulation, material success, and appealing to the widest possible audience. This attitude is also visible in the decreasing importance of history and philosophy in education, along with a weakening appreciation for what earlier generations considered high culture, including refined art, literature, and cuisine. A small but telling example of this change can be seen in food preferences. Previous generations viewed French cuisine as the height of sophistication. The baby boomers, however, largely rejected this and instead popularized Italian food, which in the United States had originally been associated with poorer immigrant communities. This reflects a broader shift toward comfort, convenience, and familiarity over tradition and refinement. Their strong focus on money is further demonstrated by the fact that the most influential intellectual figures in modern society tend to be economists, while most boomer-era presidents placed the economy above nearly all other concerns. In boomer social circles, attempting to appear cultured could be interpreted as arrogance or superiority. At the same time, discussing ideas such as honor, duty, or truth was often viewed as outdated or uncool. As a result, the society left behind by the baby boomers often behaves as if physical pleasure is the only meaningful goal in life, while moral standards and a sense of obligation are seen as unnecessary or even harmful. A powerful example of this attitude is the baby boomer slogan from the 1960s, "All you need is love." Despite its popularity, there was rarely a clear or practical explanation of what love actually meant. Without a solid definition, the idea was difficult to apply in a meaningful way to relationships with family, friends, or coworkers. In many cases, love also became closely connected to physical relationships rather than deeper responsibility or commitment. As a result, a concept that had once held great meaning in Christian philosophy was, in practice, interpreted as freedom without boundaries, with little attention paid to how that freedom might affect society in the long term. Many of the cultural changes introduced by the baby boomers involved trading a strong sense of social duty for immediate short-term pleasure. This is also evident in changing attitudes toward relationships. While the boomers experienced unprecedented freedom in this area, the long-term consequence was a gradual breakdown in trust between people. Over time, this erosion of social trust ironically led to fewer strong and stable relationships in later generations. In many countries, this lack of structure has contributed to dramatic population declines, making the baby boomers the last large generation in modern history. In most parts of the world, the United States being a notable exception, the baby boomers ultimately had far fewer children, which has placed many countries on the path toward population decline. A similar pattern can be seen in the world of music. At first, the removal of traditional standards allowed for the rise of creative and influential genres, such as rock and roll. However, as the belief that all standards were harmful continued for several decades, music began to lose structure. Instruments became less central, rhythms grew simpler, lyrics became hard to understand or lacked coherence, and many artists themselves lived highly dysfunctional lives. As with many other trends associated with the baby boomers, a short-term wave of creativity and freedom was followed by long-term decline and deterioration. Their general reluctance to support structure or enforce standards can be seen almost everywhere in modern society. Without clear boundaries, social connection weakened, the number of close friendships declined, mental health problems increased sharply, and trust between people eroded. Divorce rates rose dramatically, while many other aspects of society, from unhealthy fast food to declining film quality and poorly maintained infrastructure, also suffered. The boomers appeared largely unwilling to preserve the systems that support long-term social well-being. When individuals are constantly told they can do whatever they want, it should come as no surprise that serious problems emerge. A defining feature of the baby boomer mindset is the lack of internal discipline, combined with a tendency to frame the world in overly simple terms of good versus evil. This approach strongly influenced both politics and culture. One highly controversial example is the Vietnam War. Among American baby boomers, the Vietnam War is often viewed as fundamentally evil. Yet it is rarely explained how it was functionally different from the Korean War, which is commonly praised as a just and necessary conflict. In both cases, a communist North was attacking a capitalist South supported by the United States. The main distinction appears to be that the Korean War was fought primarily by the silent generation, while the Vietnam War was fought by the baby boomers. In reality, the Korean War was significantly bloodier than the Vietnam War. This observation is not intended to justify or condemn either conflict, but simply to note the difference in perception between the generations. The silent generation, having grown up during the Great Depression, saw the Korean War as a necessary effort to halt the spread of global communism, which had already caused immense suffering under brutal regimes. The baby boomer generation, on the other hand, interpreted the Vietnam War as an immoral, colonial-style conflict aimed at expanding American influence. They made a public moral stand against war itself and argued that drafting young men into military service was inherently unjust. However, many of those who avoided the draft did not claim conscientious objector status in the same sincere manner as genuine pacifist groups, such as the Quakers. At the same time, they often failed to offer a realistic political solution to the crisis in Vietnam, instead continuing to argue that the war should simply end without providing a clear alternative path forward. From the baby boomer perspective, avoiding involvement in conflicts made sense because they viewed themselves as the start of a new era in history. Consequently, they did not consider previous wars as useful precedents for handling current conflicts. In other eras, refusing to act would likely have been interpreted as cowardly or shameful. However, the baby boomers reframed this in moral terms, turning avoidance into a principled stance that often benefited them personally. In Europe, the pressure from the boomer generation was a significant factor driving decolonization. Whether one views this as positive or negative, it undeniably weakened European powers on the global stage, creating challenges for future generations. The boomer tendency to see the world in simple terms of good versus evil is also evident in America's international actions. For example, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the U.S. leadership, predominantly baby boomers in both the presidency and Congress, approached these conflicts with a simplified worldview. They expected local populations to welcome American forces as liberators while neglecting plans for long-term defense or nation-building. This approach reflects a foreign policy shaped more by the ideals of movies like Star Wars than by historical strategy or classical thought, as previous generations might have applied. Under prior administrations, the U.S. managed complex Cold War policies with nuance. Once the boomers gained significant electoral influence under Reagan, they labeled the Soviet Union the evil empire, and in the War on Terror, the U.S. pursued broad, aggressive action rather than a carefully measured strategy that might have been more effective. At the same time, the U.S. allowed China, an obvious strategic rival, to industrialize while continuing to treat Russia as a primary threat in 2016, even though Russia's influence was clearly limited. This demonstrates a boomer difficulty in constructing a complex, long-term worldview beyond simplistic moral binaries. Moral grandstanding became a hallmark of boomer politics, often prioritizing appearance over tangible results. For example, President Barack Obama, a baby boomer, made clear moral pronouncements, such as condemning President Assad's use of chemical weapons, but did not follow through with decisive action when those boundaries were crossed. European baby boomers have taken this tendency even further, issuing moral declarations to the world while lacking real military strength or the economic and cultural influence to back them up. Modern Europe often positions itself as a moral authority, despite declining power and global relevance. This pattern of symbolic gestures with little practical impact is mirrored in the American political system. Since 1980, as baby boomers gradually entered positions of power, U.S. foreign policy increasingly emphasized high-profile moral statements rather than strategic effectiveness, shaping decades of international decisions with limited long-term results. Since gaining a majority in Congress, the baby boomers have contributed to a political gridlock that has achieved very little, while continually signaling virtue to their own side and framing opponents as irredeemably evil. It is remarkable how much influence the baby boomers continue to wield, even as the oldest among them, those born during World War II, begin to age into senility. In 2024, figures like Trump, Biden, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Obama, the Clintons, and Bush are all baby boomers. It would not be surprising if future elections feature two boomers again, despite the generational aging now well into their 60s. Donald Trump, for example, embodies many traits commonly associated with baby boomers. He approaches the world in starkly binary terms, maintains a personally indulgent lifestyle, has a largely unrefined intellectual perspective, and exhibits strong narcissism. His political style relies on simple slogans promising immediate solutions, with little attention to honor, gravitas, or long-term responsibility. The economic policies championed by the boomers similarly reflect their worldview. They have prioritized short-term gains and personal self-interest over long-term societal stability. During their youth, quality of life and wages were historically high, a product of both extraordinary historical circumstances and the sacrifices of previous generations. Many boomers, however, failed to recognize that these conditions were not permanent or universal. Over time, they contributed to the erosion of these foundations. The late 1970s and early 1980s, when boomers began to gain more influence, coincided with the stagnation of wages in America, a trend that has persisted ever since. While macroeconomic factors also played a role, a key pattern emerges. Boomers who prospered during an era of high wages leveraged their economic position to enhance the value of capital over labor. Policies under the Reagan administration, for example, promoted mass immigration, deindustrialization, offshoring of manufacturing, and mechanization, all moves that depressed wages. Once established in the economy, boomers were able to consolidate wealth and advantage over younger generations, further reducing opportunities and quality of life for those just entering the workforce. This intergenerational economic shift has resulted in long-term stagnation and declining living standards for younger Americans, a topic explored in detail in prior sections. As discussed in earlier videos, the baby boomers came of age during a period of historically cheap capital, the most affordable and abundant investment funds ever seen. Once they were able to accumulate wealth during an era of historically high wages, their capital produced massive returns. Meanwhile, younger generations, facing lower wages and higher living costs, were largely unable to accumulate wealth in the first place, compounding economic inequality. What is remarkable is that boomers not only benefited from the cheapest capital in history but also from unprecedented levels of money printing. Much of this money flowed into the stock market, where baby boomers were major stakeholders. Yet, despite this extraordinary economic environment and their accumulated wealth, the modern world is still facing the prospect of severe recessions, high inflation, and unsustainable debt, leaving the next generations in precarious financial conditions. Modern monetary theory, now influential in Western economic policy, reflects the boomer mindset perfectly, the belief that money can be printed endlessly with economic growth magically following. Housing is another area where boomers disproportionately benefited. Property values in the West have skyrocketed since the 1980s, and boomers who bought homes decades ago acquired them at a fraction of today's prices. Younger generations, by contrast, struggle to afford small, lower-quality properties, while boomer-influenced regulations make new construction costly, further inflating housing prices to the advantage of older generations. Similarly, welfare and social programs are structured to benefit boomers. As they age, these programs are increasingly unsustainable for younger generations, who will either face bankruptcy of the systems or prohibitive costs. Notably, the peak boomer representation in Congress in 2008 coincided with the financial crisis, driven in part by a lack of regulatory boundaries in banking and excessive government spending. Environmental policy is another example. Boomers largely failed to address carbon emissions proactively, often obstructing nuclear energy development or delaying carbon taxation when it would have been politically feasible. These decisions have created long-term environmental challenges that future generations will have to confront. I once discussed politics with my boomer father while watching a speech, and it became clear how these attitudes are ingrained in the generation's worldview, affecting economic, social, and environmental policies across decades. I was very young at the time, around 6 or 7, and I asked my father what the speech was about. He replied, "It's about giving my generation money, and yours will pay for it." I responded, "That's not fair. I never voted on this." He simply said, "That's the point." This interaction, in many ways, encapsulates boomer-era economics. This video might seem like I'm merely envious of the boomers, focusing on the advantages they enjoyed that weren't passed on to future generations. And to be honest, I am. However, there is a legitimate critique. The boomers inherited extraordinary opportunities across nearly every domain, yet they passed very few of these benefits forward. How much blame one assigns to the baby boomers depends largely on whether you view humans as primarily shaped by historical context or as agents of free will. There are instances like the boomers or historical eras similarly privileged, where a refusal to uphold standards due to wealth leads to societal decline, a phenomenon historically known as decadence. This pattern has appeared repeatedly from Rome to the Arab caliphates, China, India, and beyond. I've made a video exploring these parallels and many aspects of boomer behavior: disinterest in intellectual pursuits, abandonment of moral standards to appear cool, reluctance toward decisive warfare, and short-term economic thinking that creates long-term stagnation, closely mirror these historical examples. Can we truly blame the boomers for following a recurring societal trend? In conversation with my boomer grandmother, she acknowledged, "We made mistakes, but if you grew up like I did, you'd understand why. I grew up in Nebraska. Everything was dull and everyone was so conformist. We just wanted to rebel and change things." It's important to recognize that the baby boomers grew up in a different era, and engaging with them requires a measure of humility. Every generation makes mistakes, and it's difficult to fully see beyond the context of your own historical moment. On a personal level, the boomers were the first generation to grow up after the World Wars, arguably some of the most traumatic events in human history. It's understandable that society made missteps and reacted against the previous era in response. Additionally, growing up under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation undoubtedly shaped their worldview in ways that are challenging for us to fully comprehend. The shadow of the atomic bomb loomed over their formative years, influencing attitudes toward risk, governance, and societal norms. However, I still believe the baby boomers can be held accountable. Their era of history was not fated for decadence. It was widely documented and well known in the 1950s, and they could have understood it with even minimal effort to study history. Moreover, moral role models were abundant in their time. The boomers grew up with figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and the heroes of the world wars were still fresh in memory. Looking further back, they also had countless role models: Pericles, Martin Luther, and the great philosophers of the Enlightenment. The baby boomers inherited arguably the most successful society in history, built on thousands of years of traditions and adaptations that allowed Western civilization to flourish. With such a foundation, emphasizing independent choice and free will, rooted in Christian notions of moral decision-making, the boomers failed by nearly every measure. It is difficult to identify a single boomer achievement that matches the accomplishments of their ancestors, who liberated slaves and women, eradicated extreme poverty and deadly diseases, fought global wars, settled continents, industrialized nations, and more. That said, we cannot place all blame solely on the boomers for perpetuating boomerisms. Although they have dominated culture and politics for decades, traits like a total inability to make moral judgments, a binary worldview, and short-term thinking often manifest even more strongly in their children than in the boomers themselves. Carol Quigley's concept of macrogenerations, long, multi-generational intellectual and cultural cycles lasting roughly 80 years, with radical shifts between them, is helpful here. Many of the characteristics criticized in the boomers have, in turn, been adopted by younger generations. In fact, some of the most boomer-like behaviors are more evident in millennials and Gen Z than in the boomers themselves. These traits, entitlement, short-term thinking, political grandstanding, are extensions of the paradigm established by the boomers. Our generation faces the fallout of that world crashing into the reality of limits. Yet I also observe a genuine effort to seek something new, a true, forward-looking vision for society. Quigley, in his brilliant book Tragedy and Hope, wrote in the 1960s that the tragedy of the modern world was the horrors of totalitarianism and global wars, but the hope was that humanity could awaken and construct a society worth looking forward to. The boomers have largely failed in that mission. It is now up to the younger generations to take the ashes of the boomer world and build a better, more resilient society.